still summer students, but
Okay, yeah. Yeah, pretty sparse. Yeah, very fun. I'm really looking forward to it. Actually, my first draft of my dissertation will be due at the end of August, so to go set that timeline. It's a great timeline. Buckle down.
nice.
Chapters.
Yeah.
Well,
It wasn't serious.
Joe?
Like, you know, you
she's home.
Hey,
and
great. Hey, you know what? We're just rolling with life.
yeah, I know.
And
That
this
was
is so
weird.
cool to have
Scary.
Matt, you know,
I know.
virtually.
Yeah. Where is he? Where will it be? He'll come right here.
He's going to be able to see us well. So if you just say, hey, everyone, can you say hi to Matt? And
Okay.
Sort of wave.
All right, I'll do that. Hello, and welcome to the second day of the Austrian Economics Research Conference. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce our Marianne Rothbard Memorial Speaker, a close friend of mine, someone who I've worked with on papers, and I think he is here, and we should welcome him. Hey, Matt. Good to see you. Matthew McCaffrey is Assistant Professor of Entrepreneurship in the Alliance Manchester Business School at the University of Manchester. He holds a bachelor's degree in literature from Colorado State University, a master's in economics from Auburn University, and a PhD in economics from the University of Angers under Guido Hulsmann. He is the author or editor of 5 books, most recently Austrian Perspectives on Entrepreneurship, Strategy, and Organization, co-authored with Nikolai Voss and Peter Klein, published in 2019 by Cambridge University Press. He's also authored The Invisible Hand in Virtual Worlds, The Economic Order of Video Games, which is forthcoming this year, also from Cambridge. In addition to his books, he's also published 24 articles in leading journals in management and economics, such as the Journal of Business Venturing, Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice, and the European Management Review, in addition to a dozen more book chapters, essays, reviews. He's received numerous awards for his editorial and reviewing work, and he sits on the editorial boards of 2 leading journals in entrepreneurship studies, as well as those of 5 other journals, including our own Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics. He's contributed evidence to government inquiries on the regulation of the gaming industry, and has been interviewed by CNN, MSNBC, boo, and the Washington Post, or even bigger boo, among others. His research focuses on the social and economic role of entrepreneurship, and he writes extensively on the different forms of entrepreneurial behavior that exist inside and outside the market economy, such as social, political, and institutional entrepreneurship. This work has earned him a place as an advisor to numerous social enterprises and student startups. Importantly, though, his research also draws heavily on the history of economic thought, particularly the contribution of the American Psychological School. Now, his topic today is something that's very, very close to Murray Rothbard's heart. And this is, and I think it's fulfilling what Rothbard wished very deeply to happen. And that is the long rehabilitation of Frank Fetter. Please welcome Dr. McCaffrey. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to begin by extending my deepest thanks to Joseph Salerno and to the Mises Institute for inviting me to give this lecture, and especially to Steve and Cassandra Torello for generously sponsoring it. On a personal note, I've been listening to the memorial lectures at this conference since I was a student, and in that time, I've had the chance to hear many scholars that I admire present their work and be able to draw inspiration from it. And so now, to be able to deliver one of these lectures myself is a real honor and a privilege, and I'd like to say that I'm very grateful for it. Now, as it happens, and as in fact Dr. Salerno just indicated, the topic of my lecture, the work of the American economist Frank Albert Fetter, is a particularly appropriate one, I think, for a Murray Rothbard memorial lecture at the Ludwig von Mises Institute, because Fetter was greatly admired by Mises and by Rothbard, both of whom, as we'll see, have parts to play in the story that I'll relate. So I flatter myself that they would have approved my choice of topics. Now, in relating this story, I'm going to ignore the advice of the King of Hearts by starting at the end. So if you peruse Rothbard's extensive list of publications in the 1970s, you may notice one that seems to stand out somewhat from the others. a relatively unknown 1977 edited volume of academic papers by one Frank Fetter, given the stimulating title, Capital, Interest, and Rent, Essays in the Theory of Distribution. And although this book seems a little different from some of the other publications of Rothbard at the time, and although at first glance it might seem to be a sort of innocuous side project, as I'll explain, it's actually the culmination of a half century of work, not just by Rothbard, but by many different authors in and around the Austrian tradition. This lecture then is the most recent part of a research agenda that's occupied me for the last several years, namely the study of the life and work of Frank Albert Fetter, and especially his role in advancing the Austrian tradition in the United States. A few years ago, as a part of a different project, I became aware of the collection of Fetter's papers and correspondence that are housed at his undergraduate alma mater, Indiana University. These records had been virtually untouched since their donation. And as I explored them, I very quickly discovered that they contained a trove of materials relating to economics and social science, much of it highly relevant to the ideas and the history of the Austrian School. And in reading Fetter's correspondence spanning essentially 70 years, I was especially struck by the sheer force of his personality and by his unique intellect, which was unlike anything I really encountered since I had first read Mises, and which inspired me in turn to not only explore his ideas further, but also to do what I could to better publicize them and draw renewed attention to some of his important contributions to economics. The theme of this lecture is rehabilitation, especially in the sense of repairing a reputation and restoring it to a rightful place of prominence. Economics has a long history of rehabilitations, including W.H. Hutt's rehabilitation of Say's law, and significantly for this lecture, Alfred Marshall's attempt to rehabilitate the economics of David Ricardo. The rehabilitation of Frank Fetter is a far more obscure effort than either of these, but it's my purpose to show that it is every bit as important, particularly for economists working in the contemporary Austrian tradition. Fetter was, for several decades, an acknowledged leader in American economics and was particularly known as the most consistent advocate of the subjectivist economics of Karl Menger in the United States. Unfortunately, today, his name has all but disappeared from mainstream economic writings, but the historical archives reveal that for the last century nearly, there has been underway a nearly unbroken series of efforts, especially by Austrian economists, to rehabilitate Fetter's contributions and to use them to revitalize economic theory. So it is my aim in this lecture to relate some of this history and to chronicle the rise, decline, and rise again of someone that I consider to be one of the great economic theorists of all time. Crucially, though, this is not simply a story about Fetter alone, but it's also a story about the fortunes of the Austrian school and also its rise, decline, and renaissance. Next slide, please. So my hope is that at least the name Frank Fetter is familiar to everyone. After all, his name, I think, is etched on the wall above this screen, although perhaps his name has been strategically placed behind it. I don't know. But even for those who are familiar with Fetter, it's worth mentioning some of his personal and professional history just as a way to put the discussion in context. Fetter was an American born and raised in the small town of Peru, Indiana, whose only other main claim to fame was that it was also the birthplace of Fetter's first cousin once removed, the songwriter Cole Porter. They had rather different career paths, though. Fetter was one of those many economists in the 19th century who were trained in German universities by members of the German Historical School, and whose politics were heavily influenced by early American progressivism. But unlike many of his contemporaries, Fetter developed a real love of economic theory and a strong devotion to the subjectivist economics pioneered by Karl Menger, Eugen von Brumbawerk, and Friedrich von Wieser. Fetter called his approach to economics psychological, emphasizing the personal, subjective aspect of value. His primary influence from America was John Bates Clark, who Fetter believed should have been listed alongside Menger and William Stanley Jevons as the third discoverer of the subjective theory of value. And in his turn, Fetter and several of his friends or colleagues, contemporaries, particularly Herbert Davenport and Irving Fisher, came to be known as the American Psychological School of Economics, by which was meant very nearly the American Austrian School. In fact, really nowhere outside of Austria were the ideas of Menger, Brumbawerk, and Wieser developed further than they were in the United States. Hayek, for example, recalls that when he was a young student, the work of the American theorists John Bates Clark, Thomas Nixon Carver, Irving Fisher, Frank Fetter, and Herbert Joseph Davenport was more familiar to us in Vienna than that of any foreign economists except perhaps the Swedes. And among the Americans, none was more consistent, or to use the term that was so often applied to Mises, none was as intransigent as Fetter. Fetter himself was personally acquainted with almost every leading Austrian economist from the roughly 1900 to 1950. He traveled to Vienna on several occasions to meet with the Austrians, had a close personal friendship with Brumbawerk for a number of years, and was professionally connected with many Austrians, particularly after the Austrian immigration to the United States. Now, by any standard, Fetter was one of the most successful economists of his day. In 1912, he was elected to the presidency of the American Economic Association, and his teaching career, which lasted until he was 73 years old, was spent at Princeton, Cornell, Stanford, and Indiana, but also included positions at Harvard, Columbia, Johns Hopkins, and the University of Illinois. As a researcher, he spent the bulk of his career refining and developing the theories of value, price, and distribution along Austrian lines, both in his textbooks and in a series of articles published in the leading economics journals. He's especially known for developing highly original theories of capital, interest, and rent, each of which in turn influenced the Austrians, as we'll see. Nevertheless, by the time Mises and his students immigrated to the United States, the influence of the American Psychological School and Fetter had all but disappeared, replaced by the theories of Alfred Marshall, Walras, Chamberlain, Keynes, and many others. Now, in his later years, Fetter turned mainly to the study of monopoly and took on greater prominence as a public intellectual and as a critic of the monopolistic policies of the New Deal. But he never lost his passion for economic theory, which he continued to explore right up until his death in 1949. And in particular, he was a ruthlessly consistent subjective value theorist and an enemy of all eclecticism in economics, traits that put him at odds with very nearly every important economist of his time, including some of his friends. So the question then is this: if Fetter was indeed such a successful and influential economist, what happened to his work, and why does he need rehabilitation? And the answer, in short, is that although he was a major force in economics in his time, Fetter's contributions, just like those of the early Austrians, were never fully incorporated into economic theory and teaching. Again and again, his theoretical investigations led him down paths deemed too extreme by his fellow economists, even though his work usually consisted of little more than consistently extending Mengerian value theory. Nevertheless, his ideas were continually passed over in favor of more eclectic theories, particularly those that combined elements of classical price theory with insights from the newer psychological subjectivist value theory. Next slide, please. So to understand why Fetter failed to exert the influence he deserved, it's necessary to go back to the marginalist revolution that began to transform economics beginning in 1871. Some of the more superficial readings of this change tend to overstate its revolutionary character and imply that the simultaneous discovery of the new value theory by Menger, Jevons, and Falra triggered the immediate overthrow of classical economics and of cost of production theories of value, ushering in the marginalist, neoclassical, subjectivist era. But historians of economic thought have known for a long time that this very neat and optimistic view is mistaken. The truth is that the marginalist revolution was always slow and incomplete. As Mark Blau said of it, it was not a marginal utility revolution. It was not an abrupt change, but only a gradual transformation in which the old ideas were never definitively rejected, and it did not happen in the 1870s. So, to take only one example, in excuse me, in an article written in honor of Wieser in the 1920s, Fetter observed that the subjective theory of value was still, at that time, met with resistance in the economics journals and was suffering attacks both from classical holdouts as well as sort of new incursions from the emerging school of institutional economics. So Fetter recognized quite clearly the failure of the revolution in many of his works, beginning at the turn of the century and continuing on for several decades. And he emphasized repeatedly that the promise of the revolution had been left unfulfilled. In fact, the marginalist revolution was actually a misnomer. The real revolution was in subjectivism, not marginalism, marginalism being only one implication of the subjective theory of value. Marginalist methods of analysis had existed in economics long before 1871, most famously in David Ricardo's theory of land rent. They'd also been taken up by Alfred Marshall, the great eclectic, whose work attempted to bridge classical and neoclassical theory, and also in America by Frank Taussig, who Fetter and Schumpeter described with justification as the American Marshall. I point out in passing, though, that I've been somewhat tongue-in-cheek here describing Taussig as an enemy of the revolution, as I believe his name is also etched in the wall by this screen, so I don't want to be too uncharitable to him. But nevertheless, he was eclectic in his value theory, and it was these kinds of works, still infused with the classical cost of production theories of value, which tended to dominate economics teaching and theory after the turn of the century in the United States. The result of this was that the distinctiveness of the subjective theory of value that had been pioneered by Menger was ultimately lost. Instead, it became the conventional wisdom that the insights of the marginalist revolutions and of the Austrians had been fully integrated into economics, and there was therefore no real need to distinguish between different schools of marginalism, for instance. The idea was that the foundations of economics were generally agreed upon, even if there were some slight differences of emphasis between economists in different nations or on different topics. And even Mises, at some point, embraced a version of this view. Next slide, please. But Fetter did not accept the naive interpretation of the marginalist revolution, and up through the 1920s and 30s, continued to stress the distinctiveness and the importance of Mengerian value theory as compared to the newer versions espoused in the textbooks of Marshall and Taussig and others. As Fetter put it, to make the hallmark of the psychological school the marginal utility method, or to group that school with nearly all recent theory under the title of the marginal utility school, as is not infrequently done, reveals a gross misunderstanding or no understanding at all of the major issues in value theory since 1870. Next slide, please. And further, the term marginal is inapt in its suggestion that marginality or finality is the most essential mark of this theory, as contrasted with the cost of production theory. Subjective or psychological would much better stress the contrast with that which it displaced. This feature is merely a mechanical or at best logical device, far less significant than the broader psychological aspects of the theory. Next slide, please. So despite some great energy and erudition, the best efforts of Fetter and the American Psychological School failed to exercise a lasting impact on economics. And there were both personal and intellectual reasons for this. On the personal side, there were many controversies amongst the Americans that prevented them from collaborating and presenting a more unified front against their various competitors in economic theory. Fetter, for instance, instigated a rancorous exchange with Herbert Davenport over the meaning of economics, and another one with Irving Fisher over capital and interest theory. That latter debate began in the early 1900s in the economics journals, and it continued privately in correspondence for nearly 30 years afterwards, and only eventually ceased because Fisher died. Right? So these controversies should be partly, at least, attributed to a personal failing on Fetter's part. He could be a savage critic, even to the point of being quite uncharitable. And once he'd latched onto a particular line of criticism, he often found it very hard to let go, even in victory. So in any case, as a result of a combination of some of these internal conflicts, along with various retirements, deaths, or simple shifts of interest among the American economists, meant that by the 1920s, the American Psychological School had been effectively decimated. But the problems ran deeper than just the personalities of the economists. Once more, the underlying challenge was always that the best and the most consistent insights of the Mengerian tradition had never fully taken root in the United States, despite the support they received from leading figures such as John Bates Clark. Right? Instead, under the influence of an old guard of economists in the US, people like Arthur Hadley, Lawrence Laughlin, and Frank Taussig, economic theory remained an eclectic combination of German historicism, the classical economics of Ricardo, Mill, and Marshall, and marginal utility thrown in for good measure. So as a result of this, the triumph of this alternative eclectic foundation for economics, once the energy of the psychological economists began to dissipate, Fetter found himself virtually alone for the battle for economic theory in the United States. Next slide, please. Now, the failure of American audiences to appreciate the uniqueness of the Mengerian tradition was driven home to Fetter, especially in the 1920s and 30s. For instance, in 1936, Fetter had contributed 4 chapters on value and price theory to a textbook on economic principles. These chapters were Fetter's last systematic writings on price theory, and they represent a fairly state-of-the-art account for the time when they were published. More important, they very closely mirrored von Bauwerk's exposition of exactly the same topics. And it's not a coincidence that in later works in the Austrian tradition, like Man, Economy, and State, you see these same writings of Fetter on value and price theory cited alongside von Bauwerk as classic treatments of the subject. In any case, after writing these chapters, Fetter was subsequently invited to revise them for a new edition of the book. However, after he'd begun the revision process, the book's editor unexpectedly rescinded the invitation and completely removed Fetter's chapters from the later edition, replacing them with the chapters of a different economist. And as the editor explained to Fetter, a survey of the users of our text by the publisher has revealed that a very large portion of those who have used our text have not appreciated or perhaps understood your approach to the question of value and price. A very considerable number of those who have been using the work have stated that they were discontinuing its use because they preferred the approach to value and price which they could find in other works. The publisher is convinced that our work can never be restored in the face of what seems to be a rather prevailing opinion regarding your chapters. The work will probably die unless we boldly face this issue. So examples such as this are important because they help to undermine the claim that by this point, all of the major insights of the Austrian school especially with regard to the essential problems of value and price, had already been absorbed into economic theory and teaching, and that it was only in subsequent debates that the Austrians were more clearly distinguished from other neoclassical traditions. In any case, even an economist as professionally successful as Fetter was increasingly able to find a sympathetic audience for his views. In his later decades, in the 1930s and 40s, he was certainly accorded the utmost respect by his fellow economists, but even as they disregarded his most profound contributions to the science. Next slide, please. So having said something about the decline of Fetter's influence, the next step is to chronicle the long history of attempts to rehabilitate it. These efforts were led independently by several generations worth of economists, Austrian economists in particular, and especially at a series of crucial moments in the history of the Austrian tradition when it too was under attack and in decline. Moreover, the ultimate success of these efforts runs parallel to the resurgence of the Austrian tradition in America that was inspired by Mises. Now, neither Fetter nor his students and colleagues were oblivious to the problems of trying to challenge dominant strands of economic theory. And as the debates of the early 20th century on topics like capital, interest, and rent began to die down, and as economists began to move on to other subjects, it became increasingly obvious to Fetter and others that it would require a renewed effort to sustain the Mengerian psychological subjectivist tradition in the United States. The question, though, was how to do this, and the answer seemed simple enough. Keep alive the greatest contributions of the tradition, especially through republishing older works and contributing new ones as well. Now, throughout his career, Fetter received countless requests to do both of these things, and one trend in particular is that from the 1920s onward, a persistent theme in his correspondence is the scarcity of his published writings, particularly his journal articles on price and distribution theory. An especially common request was for a new collection of Fetter's papers that would help to resuscitate the subjectivist cause in the US, especially in response to the triumph of Marshallian price theory and other developments like the monopolistic competition revolution. To take only one example, in 1928, some colleagues recommended that Fetter challenge Irving Fisher's dominance in interest theory by resuming their earlier debate and reprinting some of their early articles in a new collection and offering new arguments, new contributions to the dispute. This was one of many projects that Fetter agreed to pursue at the time in the late 1920s, but that eventually stalled and ultimately came to nothing. This was likely a combination of the fact that Fetter was overwhelmed by other professional obligations and also the onset of the Great Depression, which made publishing far more difficult for most people. In any case, Fetter began to think that the only way he was really going to successfully bring his work back into the public eye was with some assistance. And by 1935, at least, he believed that he had found it. Next slide, please. Okay. So one of the more significant efforts to republish Fetter's work was undertaken in the mid-30s by the group of Austrians based in London, mainly at the London School of Economics. This group was led by Lionel Robbins and Hayek, along with some other colleagues at University College London, like Paul Rosenstein-Rodin. This particular plan for Fetter, though, was mainly negotiated by a different UCL economist named Noel Hall. I think Noel Hall's name will not be familiar to most, so let me say something about him. Noel Hall, later Sir Noel, was Fetter's master's student at Princeton, where he wrote on interest theory, before returning to England to earn his PhD and become an influential member of the Robbins-Hayek Circle in London. He was also, amongst other things, a pioneer in management education, and eventually the master of Brasenose College, Oxford. Next slide, please. Where his main claim to fame was that in 1964, he welcomed the Beatles to Oxford. However, a few decades earlier, in 1935, Hall had traveled to the US to present Fetter with an offer from Robbins and Hayek to publish a large collection of his writings relevant to Austrian economics. Fetter agreed, and so together they quickly drew up a table of contents. The main topics of the collection were to be value, rent, interest, and population, really the four of the major topics in Fetter's writings from his early career. Despite some early enthusiasm, however, nothing ended up coming of this planned volume either. Next slide, please. So a year later, in 1936, Fetter was writing to Hall to ask about progress of the book, and Hall assured him that despite delays, it was all well in hand and that it would eventually be published. Although unfortunately at this point, the project seems to have been dropped. It's not clear exactly why they abandoned it, but personal conflict is the most likely explanation. And for once, it was not a conflict between Fetter and somebody else, but rather between Englishmen. In late 1935, between his contacts with Fetter, Noel Hall had quarreled with Lionel Robbins over plans to found a National Institute of Economic Research in England. In Robbins's eyes, Hall had been undermining his efforts to find funding for the institute and replace it with his own, and as a result, Robbins was furious about this. And while the two of them eventually did settle their differences, the damage was done, their friendship was broken, their working relationship ended, and unfortunately, along with it, the planned book of Fetter's papers. Hall did attempt to resuscitate the project a little bit later and pass it to Paul Rosenstein Rodin for publication through Allen and Unwin, but unfortunately, it never appeared. Next slide, please. So after this and some various other failed efforts, Fetter began to realize that if anything was going to come of these types of efforts, he was going to have to handle the projects himself. And so he made a series of attempts from the early 1920s to the late 1940s to do just that. So I have already mentioned some of his last textbook chapters, but he undertook a number of other original projects as well that were intended to clarify and extend his early work, and also to place it in the context of the history of economics. Just as for a few examples, in the spring of 1923, Fetter began drafting a book on the history of the marginality doctrine, which is closely related to some of the other projects that I'll mention in a moment. In the summer of the same year, he wrote the bulk of a textbook for high school students that, again, he set aside. He returned to it some 20 years later and worked on it more, but once again without finishing. And some years later in 1931, he also revised his university textbook. But once more, due to the Great Depression, the publisher believed it wasn't a good time to bring out a new edition, and so that project too was halted. And unfortunately, all three of these potentially fascinating manuscripts were destroyed after Fetter's death. So we don't really know exactly what they contained or to what degree they've been finished, although the archival evidence indicates that they were had at least advanced well into the drafting process. In any case, as Fetter was choosing to these kinds of projects and topics, he was being driven by a number of other developments in economic theory in the 20s and 30s and reacting to them. Two trends in particular that had captured his attention were the development of the doctrine of overhead costs that was pioneered by John Maurice Clark and had a lot of implications for price and production theory. And then also the monopolistic competition revolution inspired by Edward Chamberlain and Joan Robinson. Both of these developments had roots in the economics of Alfred Marshall, which in turn had been influenced by the classical economics of David Ricardo. And as Fetter worked to criticize the newer theories, he found it increasingly necessary to return to their foundations, in other words, to criticize Marshall and the Ricardian tradition as well. And this need turned his attention quite naturally to the history of economic thought. So from his earliest days as a teacher, Fetter had lectured on the history of distribution theory, and toward the end of his career, he began to think about a more ambitious treatment of that and related subjects. In 1937, for instance, he considered writing a book on economic terminology, which is a favorite topic of his. And by 1941, he developed a detailed book proposal, an outline of the work, which was tentatively titled The Language of Economics with Special Regard to Ambiguities and Resulting Fallacies. Admittedly, not his most eye-catching title, but a worthwhile project nonetheless. The purpose of the book was a broad historical study of the major terms in economics, and especially the errors in reasoning and in policy that resulted from ambiguity, inconsistency, and abuse of terms. However, Fetter offered this proposal to publishers without success. The Rockefeller Foundation, for instance, which had been a major source of funding for economic research in the interwar period, declined on the grounds that it simply didn't have the money. And this discouraged Fetter so much that he abandoned the book project and turned his eyes towards yet another idea that he had. So after the failure of this project, he shifted his attention to the idea for a book on the development of economic thought since 1850, especially those controversies over value, price, and distribution theory in which he had taken a leading role as a young man just after the turn of the century. The initial volume he suggested was going to be just a collection of his most influential and rare papers on economic theory, along with a few new contributions to give the work a kind of unity. And this time around, Fetter was more successful with his proposal, and in early 1943, he arranged to publish this book with Princeton University Press under the title The Revision of Economic Theory. But as so often happened, as he worked to put the collection together, he began to change his ideas for it and his vision of what the project could accomplish. So the new manuscript that he imagined would include a greater amount of historical material relating to the development of economic theory leading up to the neoclassical period. In other words, beginning with Adam Smith and focusing on the major thinkers of classical economics. The plan was to use a brief historical survey as a foundation for discussing the subjectivist neoclassical period, which was to be the main focus of the book. Fetter in particular wanted to emphasize the valuable contributions of Americans in the 19th and 20th centuries to economics, which he thought had been seriously neglected in the history of economic thought. Nevertheless, as he continued to work, the project continued to grow and expand, and he continued to work on it right up to his death in March 1949. Sadly, by this time, his ideas and those of the other American psychological economists had all but disappeared from the economic literature. Next slide, please. However, in September 1949, a few months after Fetter's death, Mises published Human Action, which preserved and extended the Mengerian tradition in economic theory, and thereby laid the groundwork for the revival of Austrian economics in the following decades. And it was through Mises that Fetter's reputation ultimately survived. Now, the published works of Mises and Fetter give no indication that they knew each other, but the archives show that Mises and Fetter had been personally acquainted since at least the 1920s. Mises had visited Fetter at his home in Princeton in 1926 during a visit to the United States when he was surveying economic conditions. And this was a moment when Mises's business cycle research program was really beginning to take off. And it's not a coincidence that only a few months after their meeting, Fetter published his own final extensive study of the problem of interest rates, a paper that some later scholars like Jerry O'Driscoll argue is very Austrian in its approach to business cycles. In any case, in the 1930s, Mises wrote to Fetter from Geneva to express his admiration. Mises was then writing Nationalökonomie, the German language predecessor to human action, and he explained that in these last months, I have reread your contributions on the theory of interest. It is my firm opinion that they are more important than any other contribution on the subject since Bombaverk. And this is high praise indeed, especially from someone like Mises, who could be very parsimonious with his praise, and especially given the respect that Mises had for Bombaverk. In any case, Fetter's influence on Mises was reflected in Human Action, in which Mises adapted Fetter's pure time preference theory of interest. And this was not the only way in which Mises drew on Fetter's work in Human Action. He, for example, also cites him on problems relating to capital, rent, and the democracy of the marketplace. And also in some of his later public writings and speeches, he praises Fetter as one of the great theorists and remarks that it's a shame that his work has been so neglected. Next slide, please. It was in the references of Human Action that Fetter's name was discovered by Murray Rothbard. Rothbard took an immediate interest in Fetter and drew on his work extensively in Man, Economy, and State. And in fact, Rothbard regarded his work in Man, Economy, and State as filling a 50-year gap since the publication of earlier systematic treatises by Fetter and the other American psychological economists. And for his part, in addition to carrying forward the pure time preference theory of interest, just as Mises had done, Rothbard also thoroughly integrated Fetter's theory of rent into his general analysis of production and distribution. So it's not an exaggeration to say that Rothbard recognized Fetter's importance more than any other economist besides Mises. And it was for that reason that Rothbard undertook to rehabilitate Fetter's reputation by making his work more widely available. For Rothbard, integrating Fetter's ideas wasn't enough. He thought that work deserved a serious, renewed attention in its own right. And the most effective way to do that, naturally enough, was to collect Fetter's papers together, especially his papers on distribution theory, into one convenient volume that would represent a kind of treatise in its own right, and that would enable current and future generations of scholars to once again draw inspiration from the body of Fetter's work. Next slide, please. As Rothbard explained to a friend, Fetter's contributions to interest theory were enormous, he being the first all-out time preference economist, and he also contributed a great deal to rent theory. His rent theory, I believe, to be superior to Mises, who is still under classical influence in this respect, and Fetter's rent theory permeates my book. Fetter died several years ago and needs to be resurrected. His journal articles attacking all forms of productivity theory of interest are brilliant. To resurrect Fetter would be a particularly effective part of the neo-Austrian revival underway. Note here especially Rothbard's mention of an ongoing Austrian revival. This in turn helps to undermine a different misconception about the history of Austrian economics, namely that its revival only really began in 1974. In any case, what Rothbard did not know was that this exact idea, right down to the table of contents, had already been proposed many times in the past, including by other Austrian economists. Furthermore, this book was not just some insignificant side project for Rothbard. When it eventually appeared, it was the fruit of more than 20 years of effort on Rothbard's part. His archives reveal that he had this idea, and nearly the exact title even, way back in 1955, or even before. In other words, only a few years after Fetter's death, and when he was right in the middle of some of the most difficult work in drafting Man, Economy, and State. He had first proposed this idea to Richard Cornell, who was then helping to support Rothbard financially through his work at the Volcker Fund. Although unfortunately nothing came of this project during the time of the writing of Man, Economy, and State. Nevertheless, it was an important project for Rothbard, and so he continued to shop the book proposal around to publishers for many years going forward. Just as one example, Augustus M. Kelly was at one point considering publishing the book. but for some reason, Rothbard decided to withdraw the proposal at the last minute. But in any case, it was eventually published, as Rothbard desired, through the support of the Institute for Humane Studies. The official publisher, Sheed, Andrews, and McNeil, was a Catholic book publisher and was actually far more at home printing the works of Ronald Knox and G.K. Chesterton than the economic theories of an American Quaker. Nevertheless, the job was done thanks to Rothbard's efforts, and just as both Fetter and Rothbard and many others had hoped, Fetter's work was at last once again in a position to influence new generations of economists. And slowly but surely, that is exactly what it has done for the past 40 years. Next slide, please. Fetter's work is now prominent in several strands of research in and around the Austrian tradition. These include modern debates about some familiar topics like price theory and the theory of interest. However, there are also new studies on topics like land, rent, entrepreneurship, the theory of the firm, business cycles, monopoly, and others. Outside the Austrian tradition, we see Fetter's work on capital taking on new significance, as well as his work on specific topics like consumer sovereignty. Still other scholars are investigating Fetter's political progressivism, which is one thing that actually sets him apart from many modern Austrians. In any case, the opening of the Fetter archives makes this new work in these and many other fields both possible and highly valuable, and so I hope it will continue to inspire more work in the years to come, as will the continued publication of Fetter's articles and books that's been made possible by the Mises Institute. Next slide, please. I think it's appropriate to let Fetter have the last word on his own rehabilitation. I've mentioned that his last major work was a book project having to do with the history of economic thought, but I didn't say what became of that work. At the time of his death, Fetter had only completed about half of the intended study, namely the part dealing with classical economics. Nevertheless, even incomplete, it's an impressive work, a 500-page volume titled Development of Economic Theory from Adam Smith to John Stuart Mill. It was Fetter's swan song, essentially one last broadside against the Ricardian tradition and in favor of Mengerian subjectivism. And in fact, at the time it was written, it was really the only systematic effort that had been made by an economist working in the Austrian tradition to study the history of economic thought from that perspective. And I'm beyond delighted to say that now, more than 70 years after this project was initially begun, this book will finally be published in the near future by the Mises Institute, and will be able to complement the supply of Fetter's other writings, and at last give a window into his work toward the end of his life, and in particular, his distinctively Austrian-influenced perspective on the history of economic thought. One reason I think this book is especially notable is because it gives us a picture of Fetter's broader conception of the history and development of economics. For instance, in the first chapter of the volume, he explains the history of economics as a series of reactions and revolutions among competing theories of political economy. Each generation proposes a new political economy, which eventually becomes the old political economy before being overturned by some even newer version. However, Fetter was certainly no supporter of the Whig theory of history in economics. He recognized clearly that these revolutions can and often were disastrous for the progress of knowledge. And sadly, the later decades of his life gave him ample firsthand experience of just how fleeting and incomplete was the revolution that had been inspired by Menger, Jevons, and Clark. Most economists missed this at the time, but it was Fetter's dogged support for the subjective theory of value that allowed him to see what so many others overlooked. And this is one area in which I believe that modern Austrians should seek to rehabilitate Fetter as well. His view of economics as one of constant struggle, conflict, and replacement, and sometimes reemergence of older ideas, whether good or bad. I say this because in one sense, what this indicates is that the history of economics is, in a way, a history of rehabilitations. It is unfortunate that in his lifetime, Fetter and others were unable, despite their best efforts, to preserve so much of the progress that had been made in economics when the Hungarian tradition was at its zenith. But thanks to the careful scholarship and energy of Mises, Rothbard, and others, it has meant that, however delayed it has been, the rehabilitation of Fetter was eventually completed, and his work can be and is used by current generations of Austrian economists. And once more, this is important, not just because it helps fill in our understanding of Fetter, the economist, but also because it gives us another perspective on the history of the Austrian school itself, and especially how Fetter's return and rehabilitation has roughly paralleled the Renaissance of Austrian economics and the rediscovery and extension of its core doctrines as well. Next slide, please. So the potential for this rehabilitation was observed already in Fetter's lifetime by his friend Wesley Clare Mitchell, who in the 1920s had somewhat overconfidently remarked that Fetter's ideas provided a basis for critical evaluation, which has been going on for 2 decades and which will doubtless continue for years to come. My hope in relating this history of Fetter and encouraging others to revisit his works and to look at the work that Mises and Rothbard and so many others have done using Fetter's ideas, my hope with all of this is that it will end up justifying Mitchell's optimism about Fetter in the 21st century in ways that it was sadly unjustified for most of the 20th century. So with that, I will close and say thank you for your attention. And there may be some questions, I don't know.
Do we have any questions for Dr. McCaffrey? Yes.
You mentioned just in passing that Fetter was progressive in terms of his politics. On the other hand, he was friends with all these liberals, like Mises. Did he try to integrate his subjectivist economics with his progressive politics, and did one flow from the other in his mind?
Can you hear that, Matt?
No, I can't hear the questions, so unfortunately someone will have to repeat them, I think.
The question was, given Fetter's progressive political views, in his own mind, how did he justify his economic views? How did the progressive political views flow from his economic views? Given also that he knew a lot of liberals like Mises and so on.
Yes. So I should clarify that Fetter considered himself a liberal, and he described himself using various different labels throughout his career, sometimes as a progressive, sometimes as a liberal, sometimes as a progressive liberal with a hyphen, and especially towards the end of his life, in the era of the New Deal and the Second World War and what followed, he essentially dropped the progressive label and referred to himself as a liberal, a true liberal, a dyed-in-the-wool liberal, and various other variations on this. So he seems to, in general, have abandoned some of his progressive beliefs over the course of his lifetime. Now, this is a little more complicated than this, though, because if you look at the histories of progressivism, you'll see that many progressives also describe themselves as liberals in one sense or another. So the labels themselves don't necessarily tell you much. However, Fetter was, for instance, by the end of his life, able to sympathize much more with the political or policy views of the Austrians. For example, if you read, he reviewed in the American Economic Review, he reviewed Mises's Bureaucracy and Hayek's Road to Serfdom side by side. And in that review, he points out that that these represent sort of the culmination of liberal free market thinking in economics, and that that this much had been was already visible in economics many decades earlier. For instance, he compares the histories of the German Historical School and the Austrian School in that review. Remember, he was trained by the German Historical School. And in it, he says that even from the early days, it should have been clear that the Austrians pointed the way towards a new and better liberalism, whereas the German historians pointed the way towards totalitarian socialism. So even in these, towards the end of his life, he seemed to be much more sympathetic to Austrians. He did not abandon all of his progressive views. For instance, he remained an opponent of immigration right up through the end of his life. And in fact, in his correspondence with Mises, they have some back and forth about this. Fetter says to Mises, amongst other things, "I can't believe you would support a policy of free immigration," and so on. So there were areas in which he never fully abandoned his progressivism. Nevertheless, there was a general trend in his life toward greater liberalism, greater appreciation for free markets and capitalism and so forth.
Any other questions? Back there. Matt, were there any sort of personality deficits or that Fetter may have had that caused his descent from the heights of American economic theory? I mean, you did mention his personality in your talk.
Yes. So he did have some of these personal quirks, where I think I mentioned in particular, once he became convinced of an idea, he was very reluctant to change his mind and let things go. But to be honest, having read over the course of 4 years more than 10,000 pages worth of correspondence and unpublished papers and so on written by the man, I've come to the conclusion that he really did have a serious love for the pursuit of truth in economics. And in fact, that's what led him, I think, to, as you say, dissent from prevailing opinion, because it would have been so easy for him to simply take the same approach that so many of his colleagues did. For instance, other Americans who were trained by the German Historical School and who embraced some version of economic eclecticism. It would have been extremely easy for him to do that. And it would have made him even more professionally successful and influential amongst economists. But he didn't, because ultimately the evidence shows that he wasn't convinced. He became, once he had been convinced of the truth of Menger's approach to economics, basically, he wouldn't abandon it because he believed that it was the best thing, the best version, the most true version available.
Okay, thank you very much, Matt, for a very stimulating talk.
Thank you.
I'd like to remind you that the next sessions begin at 10:15.